The greatest threat to businesses today isn't the outsider trying to get in. It's the people you trust, the ones who already have the keys, your employees, your contractors, and privileged users. 60% of online attacks are carried out by insiders. To stop these insider threats, you need to see what users are doing before an incident occurs. Observit combats insider threats by detecting risk activity, investigating in minutes, effectively responding, and stopping data lost. Give it a test drive at observit.com/Security Weekly. IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. Watch over 3,300 hours of content in their on-demand library, on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for teams by visiting itpro.tv/Security Weekly and start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off standard or premium IT Pro TV memberships using the code SECWeekly30. Are you looking for high-performance data storage that's easy to use yet secure enough for the Department of Defense? Look no further. Racktop Systems gives business software-defined data storage complete with embedded compliance, security, and data encryption. Don't let cyber threats, regulatory demands, or the complexity and growth of your data overwhelm your business. Racktop's high-performance data management platform gives you the tools you need to address the most demanding data challenges. Think beyond storage. To learn more, visit racktopsystems.com. Michael Santarcangelo, hey, what are this is
We're
so
like a
wonderful.
mirror. You're just a better looking version of it.
I don't know about that. How you doing today, Michael?
Good, man.
It's always nice to be in the same
It
room as
I
you.
I feel so bad I missed your talk. I didn't manage the clock the right way.
It's okay. It's okay.
Well, you're gonna make that available, right? We're gonna chop up the content.
Well, it's a great point, Michael. So my talk at InfoSec World was received very well. That was about open source security products in the enterprise. That one took a lot longer to build than this one. This one is about Docker security and my journey of implementing an application in Docker and then ultimately implementing DevOps. And really, it's about my journey. It was much easier to put that together because
you lived it.
It's about the stuff that I did and I lived and I just wrote my story, right? The open source security one was a lot of research because I'm like, how does this tool work? How does it interact with other tools? How do people use it? Let me go test it. That was way more work. But I've only given these talks once, and I think we should make it available to our listeners. I think we should use it for something on the shows, related to the shows.
Yeah,
do something with it.
I think that makes a lot. Look, I'll tell you a lesson that took me a long time to learn. When I got started back in the day when I still joined stuff and I was part of the National Speakers Association for the first time, Paul, I'd meet people that gave the same keynote 70, 80, 100 times a year.
Oh.
They'd done the same thing for 4 or 5 years, and that was always my reaction. I'm like, how do you do that?
How do you do that?
Well, so now that I've had some time to look at it, I've gone back in my own stuff, and I realized I've got a ton of talks I only gave once.
Right.
But I don't know about you, but now you gave a talk today. Would you sequence parts of it different?
Yeah, I'd certainly change the order.
Different?
Sure.
Okay.
Change the order, tell stories different.
So what I've learned is the folks that do this for a living on the presentation side, they give the same talk. So let's talk. So we're talking about enterprise security. If you've got like a basic pitch that's good for most of the people in your organization, don't worry about giving that every week, because although it starts to feel stale to you, it's still new to them.
Right.
And as you get better at it, your jokes flow better. Things feel better. People understand it. You have natural follow-ups for them. And so when you put all that effort into a talk like that, either it needs to be given more, or we have the advantage of we can package it up for people,
right,
and share it for more people. But just it's interesting because it took me a long time to realize doing all that work for once, it's not a good payoff.
No.
Learning from it, building on it, building on it, building on it, being able to share it makes sense. And so if you take that to the enterprise side, in fact, I had this conversation over lunch here. Don't try to, you got 25 minutes, don't try to give me a 45-minute talk in 25 minutes, because this is your shot. Don't give me 3 things to focus on. I'm going to be confused. Pick something that matters to me, get my buy-in early emotionally, lead me on the roller coaster, give me something to do, make me feel good about it, and send me on my way, and then say, oh, by the way, we've got more. If you want more, come talk to us.
Well, that's what happened today. I was like, I have more. I'm like, if you have questions, let's focus on where you have questions. And then everyone's just kind of, after I answer a couple of questions, everyone's like still looking at me. I'm like, I got other slides. And everyone's like,
please?
Yes. Okay, we'll go back. I'm like, because my talk ended just before break time, so I wasn't interrupting someone else's talk. I'm like, as long as we're here and I'm talking, the slides are up, I'll go back. Okay. And I actually went back and delivered some of my slides that I had skipped over because I wanted to get to other stuff I felt was more important based on the audience, based on the questions. So I just want to thank everyone. Like, that was cool for giving me the opportunity and people showing interest. I thought that was awesome.
And you sharing your journey is just as important. Think about how often we don't do that in security today.
Yeah.
And, you know, you and I talked on Business Security Weekly recently. Was it 83, 84, 85, 86% of people will read a case study to completion. You just offered them a real case study.
Yeah.
Here's what it was like. And by talking about the mistakes that you made or the lessons that you learned or the things that worked, people there, I'm sure a bunch were taking notes, but now they could say, oh, when someone brings up Docker, I now know to ask this question. That's quite a service. That's pretty awesome.
Yeah. And I did try and pick out some main themes that, and it's amazing how much you learn when you do the presentation, right? It was about my journey. And in looking for resources, you know, one of the themes that I learned from I actually an article from Red Hat and applied it to my own experience of things that I struggled with. I'm like, I wish I had come to this realization sooner. I'm like, all right, I got there. And the theme for me was containers are immutable. And I was like, that's something that I didn't really, like, I knew, but I really didn't understand, didn't want to understand, didn't want to do it that way.
What do you mean by that?
So when you are in IT, sysadmin, let's say back in the late 90s, like when I was starting in college, right? Mm-hmm. If you needed to spin up a new service or a new application, you had to go get some hardware. You had to rack the hardware, load the operating system, network it, build the applications that are going to support your application or your service that you're providing, configure those services, secure those services, get firewall rules around it, monitor it, hook it up to your logging.
Easy, is what you're saying.
Yeah. So you did all that, and then you were like, well, don't touch it. Like, dude, that was like a week's worth of work to roll out a new application. Don't touch that. Don't change it. Let's not break it. Let's back it up and make sure that we have a complete mirror of all that work that I just did, and let's make sure we monitor and make sure it doesn't change. When we move to containers today, you're defining smaller pieces of a larger application. The container becomes immutable. In other words, it gets destroyed and a new one gets rolled out. When you need to make a change, you change the recipe. The recipe builds a new system, essentially, or a piece of a system, and rolls that out. And then if you need to make a change or make an update, you keep doing that and iterate that process. You're destroying everything you did before in putting in something new. And maybe keeping the previous copy so you can go back if something breaks. That mindset change took me so long to overcome because I had that traditional background.
So does it take more time up front then to get the recipe right?
That's where the time is. And I said them, you know, my talk to taking an application that's not in a container, putting in a container, you're basically building that recipe. It takes a long time. And you might need a lot of recipes to have a full meal, kind of like what we're going to have tonight in our epic mealtime. You're going to have a lot of recipes that make up that full 7-course dinner, right? And all of those recipes take time to build and plan together.
Right, and you got to test it and then realize you need to tweak this or get this. And
right.
But once you get it right, then you get a lot of benefits from it.
And once you get it right, making changes and rolling out new changes is much faster. And it's interesting, you know, I read the Phoenix Project, and then Beyond the Phoenix Project, it was Beyond the Phoenix Project that actually gave me the most practical.
Is that out now, or did you?
Yeah, it is out. I listened to it. It's awesome, dude. Okay. I think I might have learned more from
I thoroughly enjoyed
Gene
the Phoenix
Kim and
Project.
John Willis just talking about the Phoenix Project than I did from actually reading the Phoenix Project. Like, and one of the things they say in Beyond the Phoenix Project, and they highlight this, is that constant feedback loop. And that having that, like, you don't have DevOps unless you have that. And if you're not getting the problems or issues to the people that can fix them as quickly as you can, and we're talking minutes, maybe hours, not days, weeks, months. Yeah. And that was big to me. That was something I kind of drew on from, you know, my days in vulnerability management was, yeah, you can go and find all the problems you want. If you're not sending those results to people who can fix the problems, checking to make sure they fixed it, telling it, well, if it's not fixed in an iterative process, then what are you doing? You're not really doing vulnerability management.
Now that you've gone the DevOps route, You like it better?
A lot better.
Okay.
From a business perspective, although this is Enterprise Security Weekly, but we'll cross streams. From a business perspective, I realized that we might need to take 2 steps back, but we're going to take 3 or 4 or 5 steps forward, right?
And they'll go faster.
The lessons I learned from the Phoenix Project were, now I can go back, I can understand my constraints. Now I can build in a process that's going to get rid of those constraints. In order to do that, I need a DevOps process such that I can roll out new features faster and more safely, right? And without breaking my value stream, right? Our value stream is PBWorks. We generate content, we get a high-def file. Our software pushes that out. No one is going to sponsor the show or listen to the show if it's not on the internet for people to consume. So that's our value stream. And, just understanding where our constraints were, how we do things better, and not just looking at it as a publishing system, but a whole process from what we know about a show. I know that Michael and I are going to do a show. I know we're going to have this guest. We're going to talk about these topics. From that point, all the way to monitoring it after it's been published is our value stream. So I built upon that. To get the software where it needs to be to do that, I really needed DevOps. So I started putting all those pieces together, not necessarily in the right order, but once I got it all kind of figured out, I'm like, we need DevOps. We need to understand the features we have so we can get rid of our constraints and operate more efficiently. And so that's what it changed the business of Security Weekly. And we're not there yet, of course. We're still implementing, but gave me a really nice map. And it didn't just give it to you, right? We had to work at it, but once we worked through it, it's really a huge benefit.
That's pretty exciting. Because I'm looking at it from the perspective at the enterprise security level. If your organization's going this direction, hop on or get left out.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is, if you hop on, imagine understanding what's actually important and understanding where the constraints are, and really winnowing down. One of the themes that is kind of erupted as you and I have had a chance to talk to people today is how many projects they're really trying to manage. And what I'm really encouraged by is a number of people will say, well, I got the list down to 10. And before I say anything else, they say, and I know that's too many.
Yeah.
And so we're trying to figure out what the 1 or 2 we can really do and get done. Oh, that's good stuff. So if you can take that mindset into DevOps and okay, this is the focus, just this piece right here, let's get this done, get it done well. Mm-hmm. That's great.
What I realized too, Michael, is borrowing from your language and your kind of process and philosophy, constraints create friction in a big way that disrupts business processes. In our case, right, let's use an example. We know a guest is coming on the show. Someone knows what those details are, that metadata about the guest, right? They know their email, their name, when they're coming on the show, and all those other things about the guest. Well, where do they put that information?
Right.
Well, maybe they put it, God forbid, in email that we've talked about, right? And then they got to communicate that to the production team. The production team has to take that and copy and paste it maybe into the wiki. They have to send it in the metadata to all the shows. And oh, by the way, the hosts really want to know, you and I, well, who's the guest and what's their information? What's their background? What's their bio? Why are they coming on the show? And so they're copying and pasting it again because you asked maybe in an email. All that repetitive task, and then you get it wrong. And then people get upset. Maybe you and I get upset because the guest information's wrong. Maybe the guest gets upset because their information's wrong. Maybe the guest employers get upset. And so that's further friction that this is creating. So by understanding what the constraint was, being able to basically build a workflow where we collect the information once, we make sure it's right, it goes into the system and it's in a central place. I was like, that's one of our biggest constraints today. I'm not saying we solved that problem, but now we know what it is and we're working towards fixing that problem. And that's huge for me.
And that'll have big ramifications, right? It's that triplet: clarify, prioritize, execute.
Yeah.
You got to get clarity. And I think the thing that is lost on some people is sometimes that clarity comes from rolling up your sleeves, digging in, and learning, and then budgeting time to step back and say, okay, what do we learn?
Yeah.
Ooh,
figuring out what your constraints are was not straightforward. It wasn't just one meeting. It wasn't just me thinking about it, what are our constraints? We had to sit down with the team multiple times, whiteboard it out, until we realized, I really thought it was going to be our software. I thought it was going to be services that we're using or a person. It was none of those things, dude. It was in our processes, right?
It's funny, and that's where the friction comes in. Now let's go back to constraints for a second too. Constraints can also be used to free up creativity. Depends on how you're using it. The way I always use that example is there are 3 primary colors. When you and I were younger, a box of 64 Crayola crayons was the cat's meow.
Right.
Now they have 178, something like that.
Oh yeah, my kids have so many crayons.
Millions of colors, but it all came from 3 primary colors. So depending on, so when we talk about
of our application in our systems, and I would get involved because I was a systems administrator, and I would tell them that these small changes, while they may seem insignificant, when you multiply that out and you've got 1,000 processes, well, now that 1 second change just became a whole huge. And by the way, if you make another one of those small changes, it may only save 1 second, but when you multiply that out, now all of a sudden that's a big impact.
That's right.
When we look at our business processes, our security processes, there's so many things like that where if you can save a step or two, that may not seem like a big deal, but before you know it, you're saving it. It's almost like saving money as well. Like, oh, what's the
But you are, though.
office space, right? Like, oh, we're just going to steal a half a penny here and a half a penny there. It's just like that.
Yeah, but it is. But what I think what I'm finding, especially in the enterprise security space, is there were things that we were promised in the 90s that just didn't work out. And so a lot of people were jaded. They go, well, you can't do that. And what I'm really encouraged by now is we look at a lot of these new technologies and it's like, wait, you can do that? So my question is always how? 20 years ago you couldn't. Now you can't. Right. Change. And the people who have answers and they say, well, processing power has changed and the number of discrete things we can measure has changed. Our models have changed and so we're able to, ooh, okay. Well, then who's taking advantage of this? And that's where we always get into, so how do you communicate that? Because if you've got something that's really cool, but you're focusing on some feature, but what you could do for me is give me back the time that my team needs to get stuff done, I'll take that, because that time is money. But it's more than money. It's also where your attention goes. It's how your people feel. It's how you feel. Doing something that is broken, I don't know, it's demoralizing.
It is. No, you're absolutely right. And I think that's always a business decision too. When we talk about either our development processes or security processes, the folks in the trenches know that there's problems that they'd probably like to re-architect a whole bunch of it. And I've noticed in my role now as more business focused, I'm like, yeah, no, that's not. Tell me all the aspects of it. Like, what's the impact? How long would it take? What else suffers when you do that? What's the risk?
That's right.
Yeah, we're probably not doing that. Now, old me, engineer me, I'd be like, yeah, dude, we need to jump right in. We need to rewrite that whole database, and it needs to be completely different. Now I'm like, okay, hold on, hold your horses. What's the right decision?
But I'll tell you what, you're pointing out it's tough to know. So what's good enough?
Yes.
When is it good enough, and you need to move on to the next thing?
Technical debt is really what we're talking about. And I've explained that to our developers too, and they're like, what's technical debt? And I had to explain it to them, and I'm like, I'm conscious that like you want to go redo this thing, and there have been points where I'm like, okay, stop, 2 weeks, go as far as you can get in 2 weeks is what you have to fix that, because I don't want to get in the situation where the next phase is I want to accomplish these great business things, and they tell me, well, Paul, all those times you said that you didn't want to go back and do those things, we have so much technical debt that it's not a couple of weeks for this new feature. Now it's 6 months or a year because we have to recoup all of that technical debt.
So the more you look at this, because I think technical debt is one of those concepts that either you get it instantly or you got to struggle with it for a while. I had to struggle with it for a while. Unstructured data, same way for me. It took me a while to get my head wrapped around what that is. Do you find then that as you've done more DevOps and you've started to look at technical debt differently, do you have a better sense of when you need to take that break and say, whoop, stop, let's fix it now, let's pay down that debt? Is it a touch thing? Are there measurements you look for? How do you start to manage that?
I don't know. I look at it today as just a business decision, right? And I think the same thing with your security architecture too. I think it's just a business decision, right? I mean, I don't know of a formula that helps you with that. I think also the right time to take a break and go fix some of that technical debt might just depend on the state of the business, right?
That's a good point. Actually,
like,
sometimes you do it because it's a good time.
I know people aren't maybe so busy or using the system at this period in time, or hey, we just signed a bunch of sponsors, we got them onboarded, like they're good, like now's a good time to take a break and go fix that, because when we get into maybe the next wave, we're really going to rely on that feature or whatever.
What's interesting in that is that in security, a lot of times we don't always have visibility to the full spectrum of the business. We need to fix that.
Right.
And when we gain that
Tom
insight,
was talking about that.
We want to share that back with people to say, by the way, the reason we're not doing this now is because it's end of quarter. This is when our sales are going to be at the highest.
Yes.
We don't have any tolerance for any faults on the system at this point, but we're going to hit a break point here, and we've already cleared 2 weeks to be able to focus on that. Because that way people still feel that they're validated and heard, even if the timing isn't right. But I think it's equally possible to be so worried about technical debt that you're always paying it down and never advancing forward.
Well,
so
and I think that's right? What DevOps, I think, has the potential to address some of that problem, in that you're addressing your technical debt as you go, right? Like the Equifax breach for me, when I thought about that, dude, I was like, wow, that is totally like a solvable problem in terms of technical debt and mitigating risk, that I was like, wow, like DevOps could solve that problem. Because rather than waiting until your application is so tied to a particular application version, early on, you're going, oh, my build process automatically included the next version of struts, and guess what? The build broke. And, okay, the build can break for how long? You decide.
Right.
Like, you get, what I like about it, you get to decide, does it break the build? How long does it break the build? And who gets notified when there's a new application, and whose job is it to go fix that, right? So, like, I'm imagining if my application was on struts, I'd go build my project, and it would tell me that, it's broken. Like, you're on the next version of struts, and it's broken. And now I have an opportunity to fix that. If I ignore that, and I keep building code, and I'm tied to that old version, now I'm just increasing my time more and more that it's going to take me. Like, the example I used was like, now I got 1,000 lines of code to go through. Now I got 2,000 lines, and guess what? I waited a little longer, so now there's 2 other team members. They each have 2,000 lines of code that they have to go through. You've accumulated so much technical debt traced back to that problem, and that's how we end up with Equifax.
I think so. I think there's another thing in Equifax that seems to be in the sub-rumblings, which is the communication between different teams seems to have been a breakdown point. And you already started by saying, look, central to DevOps working is that level of communication.
Absolutely.
So I think what you're also pointing out is that if you've got a team where you're not plugged in, you're not communicating cleanly, because I'm even thinking about it, you and I have both probably been on multiple sides of this discussion where you say, okay, so there's a struts vulnerability, you need to update struts. And one of my favorite questions is to say, cool, so on a scale of 1 to 100, where 100 is go do it now, and 1 is, where is it? And when I ask that, most people, they go, well, I don't know. Okay, well, I can't stop every build for everything.
Right.
So we need to have some ability to have a good conversation about, well, it could lead to this, it could lead to this, it could lead to this. If people start to code on this, it would create this problem. This is a good time to do it. You get other people to go, check, got it. All right, let's fix it. As opposed to Chicken Littling it where, oh, Paul, every time it's security, you say we got to update it now. Okay.
But you don't necessarily have to update everything all at once, right? And
correct.
Me in that situation today, knowing what I've learned, over the past year, I would say, look, it should be easy if you're in a DevOps environment to create like a branch on that new version and start chipping away at it, right? Like maybe you really do have, maybe you don't know how many code changes you need to make to get to that new build. Okay, you identified 6. Okay, tell me like over time, if you're releasing once a day, like how many code releases is it going to take? Granted, you have other work to get through all those 6. Is it a day? Is it 30 days? Is it 60 days? Maybe if it's 60, like how do we get it to 30? We need to address these 6 problems. You've got some time to do that. It doesn't need to be like, oh my God, everyone needs to stop and fix those 6 issues before you can do anything else. You can say, no, like, you can, one developer, you work on that, the other 3 are still working on features. You can kind of spread that out. That's how I would approach it, so that it's an ongoing, you're chipping away at your vulnerabilities and technical debt as you go. It's not a stop everything and fix it.
I got two questions. They might not be completely artful, but I'm kind of curious then on where it leads us. And I'll ask them both at once. And then, so the first question that pops in my mind as I keep hearing this is, if I'm a coder, and no one would ever ask me to be a coder, but if I was a coder, I don't want to have to go back and try to figure out what I did 4 or 6 or 8 weeks from now because somebody did something else somewhere else and it broke. So how do we get around that? And then does this then mean that this is that security has to be involved in the process as an equal participant and everybody kind of gets compensated in the same structure? Like they're almost like two sides of the same problem, right?
Yeah, I think security needs to be involved to do the threat modeling, to help everyone understand the risk, to help with the priority to a certain extent, you know.
Okay, I like that role.
But I also think that security, we need to identify the issues, but we need to form it as we're helping and saying, look,
I agree.
If you recognize this as a problem today, you'll be able to fix it more quickly as you go, rather than waiting for 6 developers to get way down the road, and now you're tied back to this. And typically, when we're talking about library versions or application versions, it can be not a huge change. Now, I understand an application server change, that could be a pretty big change.
Right.
But when we look at like libraries, like, hey, your code's using this library, you just need to update it, a lot of times that's a pretty simple change for a developer to make, and catching that earlier on means less work for the developer. So I guess that's my point, is by spinning it to developers as you're going to have to do less work if you address these now, that's the approach we should be taking.
I love that. This may be unrelated, but something else you and I have talked about over the years is, we now have enough experience to know that when they release a new operating system, it will be end of life.
Yeah.
And it looks like it'll go for a plan of 8 years. By 10 years, they're really saying, no, seriously, we're done. And by 12 years, they're actually done in most cases. But we still look at places in energy systems and stuff where historically they were built on 20-year and 25-year and 30-year models. If we start using an approach that's more agile in its nature, and we're thinking about outcomes, and we're constantly worrying about technical debt, did we start to alleviate that problem? Like, are you finding in the coding mechanisms that we have now that we can start to separate some of the operation of the code from the actual platform it's on, or we're not that decoupled yet?
No, it's the decoupling, for sure. And I think that's really, I mean, Apollo and I were talking about completely serverless environments, right? Where basically I'm just throwing my code up in the cloud and it's running it. And I think in everything that I've observed, I think we're moving towards being abstracted from the platform, that the platform doesn't necessarily matter anymore. Which I mean I like, because I know there's so many people out there listening going, I've got that one Windows 2000 box that runs that proprietary code because it can't be updated.
I guarantee you people are now saying, I got Windows 95. I can't get rid of it.
And that's an awful place to be. Whereas in the newer technologies we're talking about, you're writing your application such that the operating system certainly really shouldn't matter anymore. It really shouldn't in the newer frameworks I've seen. Now, that's not to say that we're going to be tied to some type of framework, and that framework is going to change. And so I still think we're going to have the problem. It may not be related to the operating system. I think today when we talk about Angular and Angular 2 and React, you're going to see a lot of iterations through frameworks that are implementing your code, not necessarily the operating system. So a company may abandon and say, yeah, that was the old version. Now we're on this new framework and we're not supporting the old one because that was another framework. So it's not an OS layer, it's a framework thing.
Does this then mean that from a security perspective, when we're evaluating vendors and evaluating solutions, do we have to start asking these types of questions now? I mean, I think a lot of us forget to say, hey, what platform did you build on and what's your plan past 10 years? But it almost sounds like now we need to say, hey, how do you guys do development and how tied to a platform? Like, is there anything popping up in your mind, a question or two that our enterprise audience should be prepared to ask of most vendors?
Yeah, it's a great question. I just, if you ask about what technologies they're using in their development and how long they plan to keep it around, my guess is probably 90% of the time you're not going to get an answer.
They might
and
not
if
know.
you do, it's not going to be a real answer, right? Because they aren't going to know, Or maybe at that particular time, they're like, no, we're good for 10 years. 3 years later, they're like, yeah, no, there's no way we're doing that, right? Like, we got to move to this new technology today.
Right. Okay.
So I think that's a good point to end, Michael.
I like it. Let's always end on a good
I'm just
good
kind of
question.
like ad hocing this whole episode together.
I'm thoroughly enjoying it.
Right? We're going to see if it works. We've done a few interviews, so we're going to take a break, do some more interviews maybe later or tomorrow morning, and maybe stitch together and have a show. How about that?
I like it. It's good stuff.
Thanks Michael.
Brother.